Let's go back in time a little. Exactly to February 28th, 1957. Some of you might have been there at the Vauxhall showrooms, curious about all the fuss. Harold Macmillan had just become Prime Minister, telling us we'd never had it so good. And for once, it felt true. Rationing was finally behind us. Premium petrol was on every forecourt, and after years of making do, we were ready for something new, something modern. Something that looked like it had driven straight out of a Hollywood film. Something American. That's when Vauxhall unveiled the F-Series Victor at Luton, and nothing in British motoring would be quite the same again. You remember the Victor? Of course you do. Perhaps you owned one yourself, maybe your first new car, bought on hire purchase when you got that promotion. Or maybe it was your father's, and you learned to drive in it on Sunday mornings. Even if you never owned one, you knew someone who did. You saw them everywhere in the late 50s, parked outside the new supermarkets, gleaming in driveways on Saturday mornings, queuing at petrol stations. And then, just a few years later, you watched them quietly dissolving, orange rust blooming through that distinctive paintwork faster than anyone thought possible. But here's what most people don't know, what even many of us who lived through that era never realized. This car was Britain's most exported vehicle in the late 1950s. It was sold through Pontiac dealers in America. It sparked a styling revolution that echoed through British motoring for a decade. And those catastrophic rust problems we all witnessed, they weren't just bad luck or shoddy workmanship. They were engineered into the car from the very beginning through design decisions that seemed brilliant at the time. Today, we're going to explore 7 secrets about the Vauxhall Victor that even those of us who watched them come and go might not know. These aren't the usual stories about tail fins and chrome that you'll find in the classic car magazines. These are the hidden truths about how Detroit's influence reshaped our motor industry, why your Victor rusted faster than you could say "mot failure," and how a damaged clay model accidentally changed automotive history. So, settle in with your cup of tea, because the story of the Victor is really our story Britain in the late 1950s, caught between our own traditions and American dreams, between the austerity we'd known and the abundance we hoped for, between what was sensible and what was desirable. It's a story worth remembering, even if the cars themselves have mostly returned to dust. Secret 1. The damaged clay model that made history. Here's a story that sounds almost too perfect to be true, but it's documented in GM's own records. The Victor's styling wasn't supposed to be quite so flamboyant. David Jones, Vauxhall's design chief and a former Harley Earl apprentice, created 2 clay models in September 1954. One was conservative and thoroughly British. The other drew heavily on the 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air, which was fresh off GM's drawing boards. When GM President Harlow Red Curtis visited Luton, he chose the American-inspired design without hesitation. But here's where it gets interesting. The approved clay model was shipped to Fisher Body in Detroit for final refinement. According to period accounts, the model was damaged in transit. Rather than replicate Jones's original work, Fisher Body's stylists repaired it, adding even more American flair, more chrome, deeper body sculpting, and those distinctive rear bumper portholes through which the exhaust exited. The result was a car that looked like a 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air had somehow been left in the dryer too long. On the Bel Air's 115-inch wheelbase, these styling elements worked beautifully. Shrunk down to the Victor's 98 inches, they created a car that was unmistakably something else entirely. Vauxhall's engineering team back in Luton were reportedly less than thrilled with what returned from Detroit. But Curtis loved it. And in GM's hierarchy of the 1950s, what Detroit wanted, Detroit got. The Victor, that launched on February 28, 1957, was far more American than David Jones had originally intended. Secret 2. Britain's export champion that nobody remembers. Ask anyone today about Britain's great export success stories of the 1950s, and they'll mention Jaguars, Land Rovers, perhaps even MGs. few will mention the Vauxhall Victor. Yet, for a brief shining moment in the late 1950s, the Victor was Britain's most exported car. By the end of 1959, 250,000 Victors had been sold. The car reached markets as diverse as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore. In North America alone, over 20,000 Victors found homes in 1957 and 1958. In the United States, Pontiac dealers sold the Victor during the great import boom of the mid to late 50s. It's the only Vauxhall-branded car ever officially offered in America. The timing seemed perfect. American buyers were curious about smaller European cars, and here was something that looked reassuringly familiar, yet cost less to run than Detroit Iron. The Canadian market proved particularly strong. There, the Victor was sold through Pontiac Buick dealerships, while a rebadged version called the Envoy went through Chevrolet Oldsmobile dealers. Canadian buyers, accustomed to harsh winters and high fuel costs, found the Victor's combination of American styling and British economy appealing. Unlike in the United States, Canadian sales continued through 1961, with the Victor becoming the second best-selling import behind only the Volkswagen Beetle. But then came 1960, and GM's own domestic compacts, the Chevrolet Corvair, Pontiac Tempest, and Oldsmobile F85. Suddenly, Pontiac dealers had their own small car to sell, one that was bigger, faster, and not much more expensive than the Victor. By late 1961, Vauxhall had vanished from American showrooms, never to return. Secret 3. The rust that was engineered in. Every Victor owner knew about the rust. Those of you who owned one are nodding your heads right now, aren't you? But what you probably didn't know, what none of us realized at the time, was how thoroughly it was designed into the car from the very beginning. The F-Series Victor didn't just rust badly, it rusted spectacularly, catastrophically, in ways that earned it a reputation as one of the most rapidly corroding cars ever built. You remember the old joke, Victors rust before they leave the factory. We all laughed, but in truth they rusted about 18 months after delivery, which for a new car in the late 1950s was absolutely shocking. Here's why. The Victor was designed at unprecedented speed to meet GM's global ambitions. Vauxhall's Luton plant had never built cars in such quantities before, and the pressure showed in every rivet. The body used thin-gauge steel to minimize weight and cost. Nothing wrong with that, except when combined with numerous moisture traps in the body design. Those stylish rear bumper portholes that housed the exhaust outlets, they channeled exhaust fumes and condensation directly into the rear quarter panels. The complex, heavily curved window shapes that gave the Victor its dramatic glasshouse, nearly impossible to seal properly with 1950s technology. Water seeped in, found nowhere to escape, and began its corrosive work. Then there was the plasticized underseal treatment applied to the floor pan. In theory, this was meant to protect against rust. In practice, once it cracked or chipped, and on British roads it cracked almost immediately, it became a moisture trap. Water and road salt accumulated beneath the underseal, held against bare metal, creating the perfect environment for rapid oxidation. The rear spring hangers sat in the middle of a major rust zone. The exhaust system's routing encouraged condensation. Box sections were poorly sealed. And critically, the Victor was being built at rates Luton had never attempted before, meaning quality control was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. According to the Motor Magazine's 1957 road test, the test car cost £758, including taxes. By 1962, a 5-year-old Victor was nearly worthless, not because the engine had failed, but because the body had dissolved. Secret 4. The premium fuel revolution. Here's something that those of you who started driving in the 50s will remember well, but younger enthusiasts might not appreciate. The Victor marked a watershed moment in British engine design, and it had everything to do with what we put in the tank. When fuel rationing finally ended in May 1953, you remember the relief, don't you? British oil companies began offering premium-grade petrol with higher octane ratings. Initially, around 93 RON. By 1957, it had crept up to 95. For those of us who'd spent years nursing pre-war engines on whatever rubbish pool petrol we could get, this was revolutionary. The Victor's engine was superficially similar in displacement to the outgoing Wyvern's 1,508 cubic centimeter unit, but Vauxhall's engineers completely reworked it to exploit premium fuel. The compression ratio jumped from 6.8 to 1 to 7.8 to 1. With a single Zenith carburetor, it produced 55 brake horsepower at 4,200 RPM and 85 pounds-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM. This was 1957, remember. Vauxhall could finally standardize on premium fuel because it was widely available. For the first time, British mass-market cars could be designed assuming decent petrol rather than the watery pool-grade rubbish that had dominated the post-war years. According to the Motors road test in 1957, the super version managed 74.4 miles per hour flat out and reached 60 miles per hour from standstill in 28.1 seconds. Hardly thrilling by modern standards, but competitive with the Austin A55 Hillman Minx and Ford Consul of the day. More importantly, the engine gained a reputation for reliability. Fitted with that simple Zenith carburetor, it delivered remarkably long, trouble-free service. The joke was that the Victor's engine would outlast 3 bodies, and given the rust problems, that was often literally true. Secret 5, the VX490, that almost wasn't. In October 1961, just as the Victor era was ending, Vauxhall did something rather clever. They created Britain's first true sporting saloon derivative of a mainstream family car, the VX490. If you were lucky enough to own one, or even luckier to still have one, you'll know exactly what made it special. The name itself reveals the engineering thinking: Vauxhall E-Experimental 4-cylinder, 90 cubic inches. At launch, it used the 1,508 cubic centimeter unit with twin Zenith 34.4 carburetors, a taller aluminum cylinder head, high compression expansion-controlled pistons, and a nitrided EN19B steel crankshaft. Output: 71 brake horsepower at 4,600 RPM. But power was only part of the story. The VX490 came standard with a 4-speed all-synchromesh gearbox borrowed from Opel, with floor-mounted shifter, Lockheed front disc brakes using the same units as the larger Cresta, 14-inch wheels, individual bucket seats, and comprehensive instrumentation, including a mechanically driven tachometer. In September 1963, the engine was enlarged to 1,595 cubic centimeters, and with a revised rear axle ratio from 4.125 to 3.9, the VX490 could genuinely exceed 90 miles per hour. According to contemporary road tests, it would reach 60 miles per hour in approximately 14 seconds, respectable for a 1.6-litre saloon of the era. Externally, you could spot a VX490 by its contrasting color side stripe, revised grille, and larger taillight clusters. Vauxhall took it seriously enough to offer an optional limited-slip differential, though few buyers specified it. The problem? Timing. The VX490 arrived just as Ford was preparing the Cortina GT, which cost less and soon dominated club racing and rallying. The Ford had higher profile, more motorsport success, and better marketing. By the mid-60s, the VX490 was increasingly overshadowed, despite being quite competent. It became the sporting saloon that history largely forgot. Secret 6, the Series 2 nobody wanted. By early 1959, Vauxhall faced a crisis. The Victor was selling well, but the complaints were mounting. The styling was too brash. The rust was becoming legendary. Something had to be done. In February 1959, Vauxhall launched the Series 2 version with considerably toned-down styling. Gone was the exhaust exiting through the rear bumper porthole plane. Straight bumper ends replaced those sculptural but corrosion-prone tips. The bonnet lost its dual chrome flutes. The grille became calmer, less aggressive. Body creasing was reduced. Even those distinctive sculpted rear door tops disappeared. It was, in every respect, a more sensible car. More British, if you will. Closer, quite possibly, to what David Jones had envisioned before Detroit got involved. The deluxe model featured leather trim and separate front seats rather than the bench. Build quality improved marginally. But here's the fascinating part. The fundamental rust problems remained. Those complex window shapes still leaked. The box sections were still poorly sealed. The thin-gauge steel was still thin. Vauxhall had addressed the symptoms, the styling that invited criticism, while leaving the disease largely untreated. The Series 2 sold respectably, helping push total F-Series production beyond 390,000 units by the time production ended in mid-1961. But it was a compromise, an admission that perhaps Curtis's vision had been too American for British roads and British weather. When the FB series replaced it in October 1961, Vauxhall's engineers had learned their lessons. The FB featured 7-stage rust-proofing, deep primer dip, and complete underbody seal. The styling, while retaining some transatlantic influence, was far more restrained. And crucially, Luton maintained much tighter control over the design process. No more damaged clay models receiving Detroit makeovers. Secret 7. The global assembly story. Here's something that might surprise you. While Victors were assembled in Luton, they were also built, or rather, assembled around the world, in ways that reveal GM's early attempts at global manufacturing. General Motors, New Zealand, assembled F-Series Victors at their plant in Petone, mostly supermodels with column-shift 3-speed manual transmission. Wagons were imported fully built, but sedans came as CKD completely knocked-down kits. For government fleet contracts, they built base models without the distinctive chrome trim. In Australia, right-hand drive Victors were marketed through Holden dealers starting in September 1957. Australian buyers saw the Victor as competition for the Volkswagen Beetle, Hillman Minx, and various BMC offerings. Unlike Holden's larger cars, the Victor offered European-sized practicality with that reassuring American styling. But here's where it gets really interesting from a manufacturing perspective. The Victor was conceived as GM's first truly global car. It was designed from the outset for both right and left-hand drive markets. It underwent durability testing in both Britain and the United States, though the split testing caused communication problems, and the American test regime wasn't particularly focused on the rough conditions the Victor would face in places like rural India or outback Australia. This was 1957, remember. The idea of a single model designed for global markets was radical. Ford wouldn't crack it properly until the Cortina in 1962. GM itself wouldn't truly deliver on global car architecture until the mid-1970s. The Victor was an early, flawed attempt at something that would eventually transform the industry. It failed in America, succeeded brilliantly in some Commonwealth markets, and taught GM valuable lessons about what worked and what didn't when trying to create a genuinely international product. The fact that surviving F-Series Victors are now rare makes them historically significant. They represent a moment when British manufacturing was still confident enough to dream big, when Detroit's influence seemed unstoppable, and when the idea of a British car conquering the world seemed entirely plausible. So there you have it, 7 secrets of the Vauxhall Victor F-Series that changed British motoring in ways both obvious and subtle. The damaged clay model that created an icon, the export success we've all forgotten, the rust that was quite literally designed in from the start, the engine that marked a revolution in how British cars were developed, the sporting variant that deserved better than history gave it, the styling retreat that fixed nothing important, and the global manufacturing story that was decades ahead of its time. The Victor's legacy is complicated, isn't it? If you owned one, and I know many of you watching did, you'll have strong memories. You'll remember the rust, the leaks, the way it rattled and drummed over rough roads. You'll remember the embarrassment when the sills failed the MOT, or when that telltale orange bloom appeared around the rear wheel arches just 3 years after you'd driven it out of the showroom. But I'll wager you also remember that it was different, distinctive. In its flashy, overchromed, slightly vulgar way, it was rather exciting, wasn't it? It looked like nothing else on British roads. It felt modern in a way that Austin's and Hillman's didn't. And for a few brief years before the rust took hold, it must have felt rather special to own one. Today, F-Series Victors are genuinely rare. Most of them did exactly what we all predicted they would. They dissolved into oxide decades ago. The few survivors are increasingly valued not for what they were, but for what they represented a moment when we looked to America for inspiration, when our motor industry was still growing and optimistic, and when it seemed entirely possible that a car from Luton might conquer the world. Now, here's what I really want to know. I'd love to hear your Victor stories in the comments below. Did you own one? What color was it? Did yours rust as spectacularly as the legends say? Or were you one of the lucky ones? Did you have a VX 490? And if so, I'm rather jealous. Did you work at Luton during the Victor years? Did your father bring one home new and proudly wash it every Sunday? Did you court your wife in one, or take your driving test in one? These cars are part of our automotive heritage, our shared history, and your memories, the good, the bad, and the rusty, help keep that history alive for those who never experienced it firsthand. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, this deep dive into Victor history, please do subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We'll be exploring more forgotten classics, more hidden stories, and more of the cars that shaped our motoring lives in ways we've sometimes forgotten. Thank you for watching and for sharing this journey back to 1957. Until next time, and remember, those who forget automotive history are condemned to repeat its rust problems. Though with modern galvanizing, at least that's one mistake we won't be making again.